Patriot hours. Real Patriot hours. Happy Independence Day to everyone, all true patriots, nationwide, all my friends, my family, all the descendants of the settlers in the colonies, some that snuck in over the border here and there. To all those people that aren't patriots, to all those heathens, all those mongrels. Enough is enough. Enough is enough, you know.
Enough of this heathen music! Get rid of these goddamn monkeys! Strike up, boys! Ready? This is a night for Americans!
So I'm watching Right Side broadcast or whatever, their live stream. I guess it's been a bit of a cluster because God decided to join in the fireworks celebration tonight, sending all sorts of rain and severe weather. But I like to think that he just wanted to join in on the fireworks. He put a little fireworks show in the sky to let people know who his favorite nation is on this planet. And I fully believe that we are a nation of providence. Our founding was providential. Our nation's history is full of evidence that God has a plan for our people. And I believe in our people and I believe in our God. So, in celebration of Real Patriot Hours, the 250th birthday of America, although, you know, we've been here a lot longer than that, but 250 is a good enough time to celebrate. We have to get into a more patriotic mode. I don't think standard Pop Alpaca is going to be able to do it tonight. You got Right Side Broadcast Network. They got AI country music and patriotic songs going on, with like a backdrop of the White House and the Washington Monument, and they got some sort of like AI the projectors on the Washington Monument. Trump's speech is going to be 11. I don't know. We might tune in. We might not. Fireworks after that, I imagine. But for now, we have to transform people. We have to get patriotic. So I need you guys to get ready with me. We're gonna hit play, and we are gonna become Omega Patriots. I want you to get your tricorn helmets or your tricorn hats, your buckskins, your woolen jackets. Let's give this a go. Let's go. We're gonna transform into an ultra patriot here in a second.
I just got three things to say. God bless our troops. God bless America. And gentlemen, start your engine!
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Oh, Patriot hours. Patriot hours. Oh, feels good. Feels good. All right. So, what are we talking about tonight? I've prepared an outline with some notes, with some graphics. And I hope to capture your attention a little bit because on the birthday of America, I think there's no better time than to just give me a second. Give me a second, will you? I just want to make sure that everything sounds okay on this side here. You know what? We can bump this mic up a little bit. There we go. We are going to dig into the second birth of America, and it's the one that I think characterizes the modern view of America and how it has shaped the last century and what it means going forward. So we hear a lot about the founding principles of our nation. You know, there's with the recent SCOTUS ruling on birthright citizenship. There's a renewed interest on perpetuating this nation of immigrant ideas, and that the founders were the founding of America was all about these universal principles of life and liberty and freedom and the pursuit of happiness. And therefore, what that means is we have a duty, I guess, to allow whoever they want whoever wants to come in, they can come into our nation. And once they hit the magic dirt, they become Americans. And we have to just take it on faith that they are integral to the American project, that they are a net benefit to our society, that they are just as patriotic and just as American as people whose families have been here since the beginning. And I got to tell you, the more I read the founding fathers, the more incongruous that seemed. So the Naturalization Act of 1790. Any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits under the jurisdiction of the United States for a term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Citizenship explicitly referred to white free persons. There's no creed. There's no saying like, hey, if you come and you learn the Pledge of Allegiance and can like pronounce, I guess, your name in a relatively anglicized accent, you could become a citizen. Later laws of the Naturalization Act of 95 and 98 continued to retain the racial requirement, and the 14th Amendment expanded citizenship to include native-born non-whites, but naturalization remained race-based until 1952. And even through the 20s, it was talks about quotas, and there wasn't really a focus on importing anyone that wasn't European or a descendant of like an African slave. And so the founders were there for this. Like everyone that signed the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, for the most part, was there while all this was happening. Benjamin Franklin in 1751, not the most race blind guy. Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks and tawnies of increasing the lovely white and red? The number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. All Africa is black and tawny. Asia, chiefly tawny. America, exclusively of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. So, the guy that wrote Free White People, free white persons, who's involved in that, really only thought Northern Europeans, excluding the Swedes, were actually white. The Italians and Spaniards, and Spaniards everyone understands, but Italians and French and Russians and Swedes, they're not white. They're swarthy. So there's definitely something disconnected there from like a nation for all people, liberty and justice for all people. And then Thomas Jefferson, on notes of the state of Virginia in 1785, says, they, being the immigrants, will bring with them the principles of the governments they leave. Imbibed in their early youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness. Some as come here are generally the worthless of their own nation. They will infuse into it their own spirit, warp and bias its direction, and render it a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mess. Doesn't sound like Thomas Jefferson was all that into something akin to the Hart-Celler Act. And then John Quincy Adams, in his letter to Hugh Nelson in 1818, the question of immigrants is not what shall be done for the alien, but what shall be done for ourselves and our posterity, referencing the Declaration of Independence there, or the preamble to the Constitution. There are no inducements to emigration to the United States from the love of country. Emigrants are not to be expected to become, in the first generation, good citizens, nor even to acquire the habits and sentiments of free men. So John Quincy Adams is on another level with saying immigrants, there's nothing really, assimilation doesn't happen, especially within the first generations. We can't expect them to assimilate. And so you contrast the founders, the people who are around, and John Quincy Adams, with, I don't know, stuff that we quote in modernity. You have Lyndon Baines Johnson, who said, the land flourished because it was fed from so many sources. It is a living monument to the American creed that all men are created free and equal. So in contrast to the founders, modern politicians are referencing immigration as being integral to America's success. Or you have the venerated secular saint Martin Luther King when he said, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. And he goes on to talk about perfecting the promise of America by being inclusive. And in his context, it was civil rights, but at the same time, Hart-Celler was in the mix, and they were talking about immigration quotas. And so it was this understanding that America was transitioning. America wasn't necessarily about any sort of racial demographic. It was about these ideas that are defined in the Declaration of Independence, which isn't actually a source of American law. So there seems to be an incongruity here. The founders laid a vision, but this vision was insufficient and exclusive. And exclusivity is evil and racist. Nevertheless, we have to appeal to the wisdom of the founders and their vision and attribute their true meaning to some universal principles of freedom or liberty, because the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. And we have to appeal to them because we have to feign continuity with the American founding, or the ideas will not be able to be uploaded into the popular psyche. It won't participate in the mimetic zeitgeist of the normie. And so if the founders were evil, vile, slave-owning racists, yet all forward political progress is framed as being a genetic descendant of some nebulous founding ideals, whereby it can be packaged in star-spangled cellophane and sold on the cheap as a Walmart rollback deal. What are we to do with that? Before we explore the question, I want to provide some disclosures here. There is such a thing as low IQ conspiratorial spurging. There are plenty of guys who get way out into the weeds and lose their ability to ground reality. And this is bad. I'm not going to do that here. This is not, I'm not producing a conspiracy theory or saying that all parties involved are enticed by backroom deals, that this was all coordinated. I'm not going to get into some Kabbalistic, esoteric, Masonic grand scheme. And I'm certainly not the only source of truth on this matter. This is, I'm taking 20th century history and repackaging it, reframing it into a format that I feel like bolsters my thesis. I'm sure there's evidence to the contrary. I'm sure there's arguments to be had, and I'm absolutely not some sort of like historical, I don't have a PhD in history. I don't have access to microfiches in dusty university libraries filled with primary source articles. A lot of this is sourced on archives and internet periodicals from the time, but what can be digitized. And there's certain, I'm not myopic or monomaniacal to assert that one group has the monopoly of influence over the course of American history. I think that's a trap you can fall into, where if there is evidence of collusion or at least aligned incentives between members of a group, disparate members of a group, it could be assumed that they have control rather than influence. I'm not asserting they have control. I'm asserting that influence was used. So there's lots of groups that you can point to. Plenty of them are homegrown groups, that were cancerous to the nation. You can look at Quakers and abolitionists and suffragettes and Anabaptists and any number of the charismatic cults that sprung up in the 19th century. There's lots of blame to go around for the overall decline of America. What I am pointing to is a single trend that I have noticed that I think has explanatory power. So what I'm presenting are data points on a historical graph. These points are integrally linked, but they are not always linked. They're often integrally linked, but not always. Some are disparate and disjointed entirely, but the purpose of the analysis is to plot points on the graph and formulate a theory that not only fits the trend, but has predictive power to show where new data points are likely to emerge. And so in my conversations, this is what I call mapping onto reality. if you have a belief or a heuristic or a political hot take that you could fit onto some data and like show something it might be correlated, great. But does it have explanatory power? Does it have predictive power? And if not, you're probably wrong. And that's, after COVID, there was a lot of the rise of a new conspiratorial class of like right winger, especially within the podcast sphere. And these are people that had the ability to like notice patterns, but noticing is only good if you're good at predicting. We want prescience. We don't want just people that are spurging. That's what I'm trying to do here. I have enough data points to draw a trend, and I believe my thesis, has explanatory and predictive power to describe modern American history and culture. So, here's the thesis. My equation has 3 parts. The founding mythology and historiography of the United States of America was completely and totally revised in the 20th century and purpose built to be wholly disconnected from the ethnographic roots of that history, while still being palatable enough to be sold to the descendants of that founding as having ideological continuity. A lot of big words. The founding mythology and historiography of the United States of America was completely and totally revised in the 20th century and purpose built to be wholly disconnected from the ethnographic roots of that history, while still being palatable enough to be sold to the descendants of that founding as having ideological continuity. All right, you with me? You guys still with me? All right. The revision stems largely from Jewish immigrants to America who arrived at the turn of the 20th century, fleeing the poverty and persecution of the Pale settlements and pogroms. A diasporic people with a very long history of cyclical persecution and expulsion, non-Christian ethics, relatively high verbal IQ, ethnic solidarity, and unusual money resources. The Jewish immigrants to America were able to land here, generate wealth and cosmopolitan status, both legitimate and by illegitimate means, ingratiate themselves into America's legal, academic, and cultural institutions, and wage a century-long, multi-pronged campaign against the Anglo-Saxon heritage of America in order to bring about ever-increasing openness and acceptance of foreign folkways, specifically Jewish folkways. But in totality, they're happy if you're accepting of just anything that's, not exclusive. Okay. This campaign, and this is the final part, last part. The campaign is observable in 4 steps. 1, cultivate legal and political influence to increase tolerance within America's laws. 2, develop marketing and psychology as scientific resources for the purposes of maximizing the efficiency of pro-openness propaganda. And 3, revise American scholastic textbooks and academic curricula to frame the founding as ideological and universal to all mankind. And 4, fund a media monopoly to reinforce your messaging through television, radio, and popular culture, and enforce acceptance of your propaganda as a requirement to engage with polite society. And for the 4 parts, they didn't necessarily have to happen all at the same time, but there's overlap. So let's break it down. It is obvious. So the founding mythology and historiography of the United States of America was completely and totally revised in the 20th century and purpose-built to be wholly disconnected from the ethnographic roots of that history, while still being palatable enough to be sold to the descendants of that founding as having ideological continuity. So it's obvious from the writings of the founders that America was essentially a product of Anglo-Saxon ethnicity with admixture from other parts of Northern Europe. Further, it was a pan-Protestant project, although other forms of Christianity and even some pagans were tolerated, but never promoted by the government. However, denying this reality is foundational to a modern understanding of American history. The question of when did this incongruity happen and who did it originate from is vital to understanding the 20th century. So we're going to go through a few examples here. And just to show you guys, this is the ethnography of the colonies. And it's you have African slaves in clusters, in plantation clusters. It's English, Welsh, Scots, Scot-Irish, the Ulster Scots, Scottish, proper Scots, some Germans in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Dutch colonies. and then additional Dutch that settled in the Delaware River area, and some obviously New Amsterdam. So the northern Europeans, primarily with African slaves, and some you could see in Charlestown, Savannah, New York, and Philadelphia, and Rhode Island, and Newport, Rhode Island, are enclaves of like small segments of where American Judaism was tolerated. And in the South, it was obviously mostly for Sephardic Jews that were involved in the slave trade. So let's take a quick look at. I'm skipping ahead. Whoops. So this a couple of quick examples for the incongruity that started. There's Gunnar Myrdal, The American Dilemma. So Myrdal coined the phrase the American Creed and defined it as a set of universal ideals of liberty, equality, and justice. He wrote that America's identity is a nation of immigrants and that the American Creed is the national ethos. His book was founded by the Carnegie Institution and used by activists to reframe national identity. Myrdal was a Swedish social democrat, but it was funded by the leaders of the Carnegie Incorporation, the Carnegie Corporation, which was Samuel Stouffer and Richard Sterner. Harry S. Truman message to the Congress on immigration in 1953, echoing Myrdal, declared, "Our immigration policy should be generous and fair. The United States has always been a haven for the oppressed. We must not close that door." A marked shift from the racial national to humanitarian framing. And so this was Truman taking the idea that there was put upon religious minorities, like Protestant religious minorities from England that settled were some of the earlier colonies in the U.S. And therefore, because they were oppressed, America has always been a haven for the oppressed. I don't think that plays out. Hart Celler, when they sold that, Ted Kennedy said the bill will not flood our cities with immigrants. It will not set up ethnic mix in our societies. Hiram Fong said the bill will do much to redeem America's promise as a land of freedom and opportunity for all men of all races and creeds. And the act replaced natural origin quotas with a preference system based on family reunification and skills, radically altering ethnic demographics within 2 decades. It was intended as a creedal open door policy, and it had the effect of diluting historic populations. Hart Celler is where most of our issues with the third world immigration started. And the Lyndon Johnson, we already talked about him a little bit. So what I'm going to try to do here is lay out exactly the timeline for this idea that the founding mythology was revised, and then show who was involved and how they did it. So the revision stems from largely Jewish immigrants to the America who arrived at the turn of the 20th century fleeing poverty and persecution of the Pale Settlements and pogroms, a diasporic people with a very long history of cyclical persecution and expulsion, non-Christian ethics, a relatively high verbal IQ, ethnic solidarity, unusual monetary resources. The Jewish immigrants to America were able to land here, generate wealth and cosmopolitan status by both legitimate and illegitimate means, ingratiate themselves into America's legal and academic and cultural institutions, and wage a century-long, multi-pronged campaign against the Anglo-Saxon heritage of America in order to bring about an ever-increasing openness and acceptance of foreign folkways. So this one requires a little bit more breakdown. Immigration was a known source of demographic problems at the turn of the 20th century, and it was highly scrutinized since people had living memory of the potato famines and the Irish migration and the Italian migrations that were starting in the north, and how that played out within the Civil War, and then within population demographics within the cities and ghettoization and ethnic enclaves. It wasn't good, so they commissioned many of these, but one of them, the Dillingham Commission. In 1911, the commission found that Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe arrived with larger average amounts of money than any other major immigrant group. It noted a high incidence of fraud, petty larceny, and prostitution among Jewish-born population in port cities. The report also documented the existence of Jewish organized crimes and protective associations in the Lower East Side. And so the the mechanisms for this is unclear. The stories are, you know, not not widely spread because of in-group solidarity. But you can imagine that many of the people that came over were lenders, were jewelers, and that sort of thing. We either had like high caste skills, or were engaged in some form of business in Eastern Europe um, that was able to, you know, generate money for them. This wasn't laborer class people coming over, or, you know, people escaping famine. These were people escaping the effectively the ghettos under the Tsar and under Eastern Europe. Another commission was the Jewish Community of New York report of the Committee on Crime in 1917. The Kahila, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which is a Jewish self-governing body. Which, again, why would we allow ethnic enclaves and self-governing bodies to exist in American soil? But that's beside the point. This Kahila uh, commissioned a study to address rising criminality in the Jewish enclave. The report admitted our people are represented in the criminal statistics out of all proportion to our numbers. Uh, this is a reproach to which we must respond. It detailed gambling, extortion, fencing rings run by Jewish gangs, and it advocated for internal reform. One thing that is kind of evident anytime you see mobster movies from the turn of the century, it's always the Italian guys, right? Is the wise guys. You know, they run around with the Tommy guns. They're busting up during Prohibition. They're running liquor. They're having illegal gambling dens and whorehouses and that sort of thing. And the show is always, I think what is it? Boardwalk Empire was one of the first to show the mafia and the mob culture of New York and Chicago and Philadelphia to be as diverse as it really was. There was a lot of Jewish involvement in those. The New York Times in 1908 wrote an article about the Yiddish Black Hand, a so-called Yiddish Black Hand Society, has been terrorizing the Jewish quarter in the Lower East Side. The members are recent immigrants from Russia and Poland who operate by threats of violence. So they were running extortion rings and protection rackets, all that kind of stuff. Very mobster behavior. And then Meyer Lansky personal papers, which are part of the Morgenthau collection of Columbia University. Lansky was a Jewish immigrant from Grodno, documented his early activities in the Bugs and Meyer gang with Benjamin Siegel. His memoirs, published posthumously as Meyer Lansky, The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Mafia, indicate that the first capital for bootlegging and gambling came from savings plus a little smuggling from the old country. The term stolen assets is not explicit, but smuggling of assets was widespread. And this goes back to the rumors that I was never able to substantiate it with any sort of like real research, but Dennis Prager, it was always rumored that he was involved in some sort of precious metal smuggling operation to steal from Russia and smuggle assets back into the U.S. So they were here, they were enclaved, they were generating monetary success, and to be fair, a lot of them were doing it legally. You know, there was bookkeepers, and there was, Cat's Deli is as old as any other, any of these immigrants. So there was, it's not, these aren't monolithic activities, but it is showing that there was significant resources being generated more, especially compared to the other immigrant cultures that were being generated from these Jewish immigrants from the Pale at the turn of the century. The money gives you political access. So you end up with having local and state governments on the East Coast becoming hubs of Jewish activity. And that's how you end up with something like FDR's Brain Trust in 1933. Key Jewish appointees included Bernard Baruch, the War Industries Board, Felix Frankfurter in the Supreme Court, Samuel Roseman, speechwriter, Benjamin Cohen, legal counsel, and Isidore Lubin, the Commissioner of Labor Statistics. And these individuals helped draft the New Deal legislation that broke the power of the WASP financial establishment. And this is all part of the FDR White House appointment logs and memoirs of Sam Rosenman. Political power allowed them to advocate for increasing secularity, openness, and tolerance of seemingly un-American behavior, helping to normalize the unassimilable immigrants as being a facet of American civil life. So you see early on in the 20s and 30s, there's an attack on our political structure and changes to the laws, primarily in surrounding like city law, but were and sorry, I lost my train of thought. You see modifications of the law in cities as well as laws at a federal level under FDR, where these political mover operators were able to change speech laws and get SCOTUS rulings in their favor that increased the amount of tolerance for effectively anti-Christian behavior, or if not anti-Christian, then non-Christian behavior. And so, in terms of the 4 steps, so we could show you kind of examples of what I mean by that. And again, the 4 steps: law and politics, marketing and psychology, revisions to academia, and then media and cultural monopolies. These all happen somewhat sequentially, somewhat simultaneously. It's not coordinated. It's just these are events on the graph. These are points on the graph. So the transfer of the Frankfurt School to Columbia University in 1934. The Institute for Social Research relocated from Geneva to New York under Max Horkheimer. Its faculty included Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and Leo Lowenthal, all Jewish exiles, and they received funding from the American Jewish philanthropists. And you can read about that in Horkheimer's correspondence with Columbia President Nicholas Murray Butler, archived at the University of Frankfurt. And their works, example Adorno's The Authoritarian Personality in 1950, were used as a vector for cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism in the U.S. took 2 forms. On the left, you have a general march through Marx, with mixed in with like a postmodern critique, where you have to re-examine all cultural norms, all traditions, all laws, and recontextualize them for a culture to identify effectively, just to generate your society, because nothing becomes solid anymore. You have to go through and relitigate every presuppositional prior your entire culture has from all time. But on the right, it was from the Trotskyites, who also were part of this Frankfurt School transition, and they were ended up being descendants of Leo Strauss, and what is it, Jaffa? Yeah. So multi-pronged attack on culture from left and right. Primary source: Hollywood studio moguls. So you have the testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, in 1947. The unfriendly 10 witnesses were largely Jewish screenwriters and directors. Jack Warner, the Jewish studio head, testified, "I believe that the motion picture industry has been for many years the medium for subversive propaganda. Certain producers, writers, and directors have used the screen to undermine the American tradition." And studios were dominated by Jewish founders. Many of these guys were cool. Like, they made some pretty Kino films. But there was also, Hollywood was effectively created so that they could escape censors and do their own thing out in the desert. There was a ethnic enclave that became a vector for subversion in culture, and effectively allowed them to establish a monopoly, especially once the prior American WASP structure was pretty much gone from a financial point of view. Ernst Dichter, and the Strategies of Desire. He was a Jewish Austrian immigrant and a Freudian psychoanalyst. He pioneered motivational research and advertising. He worked for firms like CBS and BBDO, and his methods he claimed he had methods to deliberately bypass rational arguments and use subconscious manipulation to sell products and ideas. He advised on political campaigns as well. And his book is a primary resource that reveals the mentality of engineering consent to reshape cultural norms. So this is a point, and we're talking about the 4 strategies. This is marketing and psychology as a vector of attack. And before the 20th century, front of the 20th century immigrants, Marketing was, here's product, here's description of product. The addition from Freudian psychology was you don't really care about the product, you care about the psychology behind the product and how it makes you feel, and how what are your underlying jealousies and envies that you can nurse and cultivate by engaging with this product. And it became pretty subversive. The CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom through 1950 and 1967 declassified CIA documents, which declassified CIA. Joe Rogan, we got the documents. Available at the National Security Archive, show that the agency funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a front organization that paid Jewish intellectuals, example, Sidney Hook, Daniel Bell, Irving Kristol, Lionel Trilling, to produce anti-communist but also culturally pluralist literature. Congress sponsored journals like The Encounter and The Partisan Review, which promoted the end of ideology and the creedal melting pot narrative. An internal CIA memo in 1953 states the Congress must continue to influence the European intelligentsia towards acceptance of the American propositional ideal. Now, there was reasons for this that aren't just diasporic people looking to ingratiate them, or looking for a way to secure their future. We just fought a world war against nationalism and fascism were the two main enemies, and now you were in effectively a Cold War with communist Russia, and so there was I guess a national defense interest in promoting pluralism and having the rah rah America attitude, since we were one of two major hegemons left in the planet. Richard Hofstadter, The American Political Tradition in 1948. Richard Hofstadter was a Jewish. He reframed American history as a history of ideological consensus around liberal capitalism. He dismissed earlier ethnocultural interpretations, and in the preface to his book, he writes, "The major political traditions of the United States have been essentially liberal. The conflicts of the past were more like family quarrels." And this book became the standard college text, replacing older nationalist historiographies like George Bancroft and John Fiske. So here you see a promotion within academia allows them to establish their ideas as fundamentally true, and therefore becoming the standard by which future curricula is judged and generated. The Harvard Studies Project in the 1960s and the New Social Studies, the curriculum influenced by Jerome Bruner and other Jewish education research, example Donald Oliver and Fred Newman, explicitly taught that America was a global nation of immigrants, a quote, global nation of immigrants. Primary source, Man, A Course of Study, MACOS textbooks, which depicted all civilizations as relative and America as a melting pot. And these replaced traditional civics textbooks that emphasize the Anglo-Saxon heritage. And then foundation grants, so Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all the old WASP foundations talk about failure of succession planning. These foundations became largely run by Jewish executives, McGeorge Bundy at Ford, James A. Perkins at Carnegie. They funded the Myrtle Study, the NAACP, the Mexican American Defense League, the Education Fund, and the Immigration Reform Advocacy. Annual reports from the Ford Foundation, example, in 1966, state the foundation's goal is to bring about a society in which differences of race, religion, and national origin are irrelevant. This requires a re-education of the American people about their own history. So here's money going specifically towards the purpose of revising the American founding ethos in favor of pluralism. Now, again, doesn't have to be for purely diasporic reasons. The 60s and 70s were height of civil rights era. So, there was a grand consensus that was built about apologizing for the sins of slavery and Jim Crow, and how we need to, become more egalitarian to live up to our founding. I just don't think that's particularly, I don't think it's particularly organic, as it were, as much as they'd like to say it was. And this is that's a picture of James A. Perkins. But anyway, I hope this is enough to get you thinking, like, wait a minute, what's happening here, right? because there's something happening here. If there's all these things that, there's dots on the line on the chart. You're noticing the pattern. You haven't been able to really figure out what the pattern means, and you certainly can't predict anything down the line by, having this little low resolution view of the pattern. So I'm going to give you more. First, what we're going to do, we're going to take a brief intermission. We're going to pop in a little cough drop, maybe take a sip of the silly juice, crack open a beer. It's the 4th of July. Happy 4th. Let's go to intermission real quick.
Now, of course, what does he mean by American values? Where did those American values come from? What year were they invented? I mean, what are we dealing with right now? We've got the Asian lawyer from the ACLU and Ketanji Brown Jackson wondering what the founders meant. I mean, does anyone else see the absurdity here? So like Chinese birth tourists and every Mayan in some Central American jungle can crawl in here and say they're just as American as we are? We all know what's going on here, and so do they. This whole thing is a farce. What are these American values? Because if we actually want to go to the founding generation, you want to talk about American values, those values were religious fanaticism, white nationalism, race war for land acquisition, and a determination to shoot anyone who says you have to pay your taxes. There's your American values. I mean, this country was founded by racist smugglers, frontier warlords, land speculators, and plantation owners pretending to be Romans. And that's why it's the greatest country in the world.
Based. All right. So let's go into a timeline. You have a low resolution view. I've given you some dots on the chart. You have some dots. You're thinking, it's the Jays. No, it's not. It's not all of them. But let's talk about it. Oh, wrong one. There it is. So what is the genetic history of this nation of immigrants, of the proposition, of the creed, of the idea that we've always been a haven for the world's refuse? 1903, Emma Lazarus wrote the poem, The New Colossus, and engraved it. It was engraved on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The bronze plaque installed in 1903 reads Lazarus's 1883 sonnet. Key lines were, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Emma Lazarus was a Jewish American poet from a Sephardic New York family. He wrote the poem in 1883 to raise funds for the pedestal. The poem was largely ignored in the early 20th century. Now, I don't know about an immigration policy but if you're basing it on this poem alone, do we really want a nation, the homeless, the tempest tossed? Do we want the wretched refuse from some third world teeming shore? I don't think we want that, but a system is what it does. So the counter reaction to this, the poem was not immediately embraced by WASP elites, obviously. The Statue of Liberty, it was intended to be a symbolism of Franco-American friendship and a Republican liberty in general. The statue's official title was Liberty Enlightening the World. The immigration asylum interpretation was a later retrofitting. For example, the New York Times in the 3rd of May, 1883, covered the pedestal fundraising, but did not mention the poem at all. The poem was not widely quoted to the public, quoted in public discourse until post-1945, the Mean Mustache Man. Many Americans at the time saw it as a cute little flourish. you cute little peasant girl. That's an adorable poem, I guess. But it certainly wasn't a national binding promise. Emma Lazarus wasn't crafting our immigration policy. So that's Nation of Immigrants, I guess, one of the starting points. How about Melting Pot? Well, Israel Zangwill was a playwright that wrote The Melting Pot, a play that premiered in Washington, D.C. on October 5th, 1908. A protagonist, David Quixano, a Jewish Russian immigrant, declares, "America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making you American." Zangwill was a Jewish English playwright. President Theodore Roosevelt attended the premiere and reportedly shouted from his box, "That's a great play, Mr. Zangwill." Come on, Ted. Roosevelt later wrote approvingly of the melting pot as a metaphor for assimilation in his Letters, Volume 6, 1908. However, Roosevelt's own views on race were far from open borders, and he endorsed the assimilation of European stock into a single American race. And that's where you end up with Teddy Roosevelt's hyphenated American speech. Of course, the Heritage American reaction, melting pot became a rallying cry for progressive assimilationists, but nativists immediately responded to it. The Immigration Restriction League wrote pamphlets warning that the melting pot does not melt, and that Southern and Eastern Europeans would spoil Anglo-Saxon blood. The Dillingham Commission in 1911 explicitly rejected the melting pot paradigm, calling for racial quotas. Nobody melts. Nobody melts. Nobody assimilates. Anyway, 1913, these guys started. The Anti-Defamation League was founded by B'nai B'rith. They got their charter going, and it was ostensibly started to, quote, stop the defamation of Jewish people, to secure justice and fair treatment to all citizens alike, and to combat the dissemination of prejudice against any group. The ADL, funded by B'nai B'rith, the Jewish fraternal organization, immediately began lobbying against restrictive immigration laws and for Americanism programs that promoted ethnic tolerance. By the 1930s, the ADL was rewriting school textbooks to remove negative references to Jews and immigrants. And they're their own primary source, The Races of Mankind, a pamphlet distributed to schools that argued racial differences are trivial. No mention of a Mississippi textile mill worker that probably absolutely did molest and murder a young woman that was working there, and the ADL got him off. But anyway, or no, that's a different story for a different time. 1914 through 1960. So Louis Brandeis, he was the first Jewish Supreme Court judge. He wrote a book. Well, it's like an essay compendium, but The Jewish Problem: How to Solve It. And his essay, True Americanism. Brandeis argued that Jews could fully assimilate into American civil life while retaining ethnic identity as a distinctive group. He wrote, "The new nationalism adopted by America is essentially cosmopolitan. It recognizes that the strength of the nation lies not in the identity of its parts, but in the organic unity of its diverse parts." Brandeis, a Jewish immigrant from Kentucky, ironically, of Central European Jewish stock, became the first Jewish Supreme Court in 1916, appointed by Woodrow Wilson, and he used his position to promote Zionism and pluralism simultaneously, and did a lot to restrict attacks against degeneracy by calling it free speech. So Brandeis immediately uses this idea of new nationalism, is cosmopolitan. And that is where we derive our identity. So cosmopolitan, you should see that and see continental, a more European mode of being, specifically an Eastern European mode of being, in which one does not do labor. One exists within confined urban communities and keeps his hands clean. 1950 to 1924, Horace Kalin created the cultural pluralism theory. Horace Kalin wrote Democracy versus the Melting Pot in the magazine The Nation in February of 1915. And Kalin argued that immigrants should not assimilate. They should not assimilate. They should retain their ancestral cultures within a federation of nationalities. And he wrote, "Men may change their clothes, their politics, their wives, their religion, their philosophies to a greater or lesser extent. They cannot change their grandfathers." And Kalin was a Jewish philosopher born in Silesia and raised in America, and his concept of cultural pluralism directly challenged the Anglo-conformity model. It also challenged Brandeis's model, which was we're all just going to assimilate to vague cosmopolitan values. But Heritage Americans reaction to it. The New York Times in 1915 editorialized against Kalin, saying the whole idea of a, quote, federation of nationalities is un-American. We are a nation of individuals, not groups. McCallan's ideas were adopted by the Jewish community and later by the multiculturalism movement. So, Kalin provided an academic, rationale for not assimilating. Why would you assimilate? Well, America could be great. It's a federation of nationalities. That's what makes us great. All its disparate parts acting incoherently, mashed together in some sort of urban setting. So then we get into the 1920s. The Immigration Quotas Act. Where am I? I don't know. my stuff's out of order. Crap. No. Pretty sure that's Forrest Galen. Yeah. No, whatever. So the Immigration Quotas Act, a heritage American backlash. So in the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas, reducing Eastern and Southern European immigration to a trickle. Congressman Albert Johnson, a patriot, stated on the floor, the United States is our country. Our forefathers made it, and if we are to maintain our racial quality, we must exclude the hordes of aliens who are threatening to overwhelm us. That's from the 68th Congress in 1924. Jewish immigration was cut from roughly 100,000 per year to fewer than 6,000. And this was a direct reaction to the wave of Jewish and Italian immigrants from 1880 to 1920 and the perception that the melting pot was failing because we were getting ethnic enclaves. We were getting the fruit salad of of a nation. We were getting crime. We were, and the Heritage American reaction, the Klan of all people, which had 4 to 5 million members at the time in the 1920s, actively lobbied for the 1924 Act. The Klan's newspaper, the Fiery Cross, in 1924 ran a headline: "Keep America American," and 100% Americanism. And turns out this was the high water mark for the political hegemony of white heritage Americans. It's all downhill from there. Here it is. The Common Ground movement begins in the 1920s. So Common Ground magazine, published by Common Council for American Unity, 1939 to 1949. The council was founded by Jewish philanthropists, including the Rosenwald Fund, which is a fund that was largely involved in pre-Civil Rights Act anti-segregation activism, and led by the poet Louis Adamec, who was a Slovenian immigrant. Adamec wrote A Nation of Nations in 1945, which argued that America was a, quote, mosaic of people, not a melting pot. The magazine and its associated Americans All, quote, Americans All program, were distributed to public schools and veterans organizations. Worth noting, it's likely that Adamec, the guy that wrote, that was part of this Common Ground movement, who wrote A Nation of Nations, that was able to was seeing that the propaganda surrounding the idea of the melting pot was failing because people were experiencing what the melting pot actually was at the time, and so he came up with a new thing, a mosaic. No, it's not a melting pot. They're not going to change. They're never going to change. They're never going to assimilate to your folkways. You're the bigot. You need to accept their folkways and just tolerate their folkways. It doesn't matter what they're doing, how many people they have living in the same house, or how disgusting their little ghettos are, or how intimidating their organized crime mob are. You got to be accepting. And it turns out this guy was probably a communist spy. And he was from, like I said, he was Slovenian, and he was a big fan of the Tito regime in Yugoslavia. And it's up in the air, but it's likely he either set his house on fire and shot himself in the head with his rifle, because he was getting threats from from American Soviet spies for his support of the Tito regime and like the anti-Stalinist communists, or he was murdered by Soviet spies who also tried to burn down his house to hide the evidence. Tomato, tomato. But just a weird little tidbit as part of the Common Ground magazine, because you can't help but notice that the melting pot, the fresco, the mosaic, whatever you want to call it, the fruit salad of immigration, also means that you get to bring your ethnic conflicts with you. No American in the 1950s should have cared what was happening to Yugoslavia, other than to say, like, it's good that the Soviets took one on the chin. Uh, and I guess Yugoslavia had like some self determination under a brutal dictator. I don't know. But there certainly shouldn't be people murdered in the U.S. because they support Tito. There shouldn't be anyone in the U.S. that supports Tito. There shouldn't be Slavs in the U.S. that are like advocating for their own dictator. Uh, Another fun fact: the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to host Common Ground events. So these guys were like the cringe TPUSA. The American Legion, at its 1941 convention, passed a resolution condemning any propaganda which teaches America as a nation of hyphenates, falling back to the Teddy Roosevelt speech. So, based American Legion, based Daughters of the Revolution. This guy is fun. Edward Bernays. So, he was effectively, I like this guy. This guy is one of my favorites, and I quote him all the time. But Edward Bernays wrote Propaganda in 1928 and The Engineering of Consent in 1947. Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, a Jewish Austrian immigrant, is the father of modern public relations. He advised the Woodrow Wilson Committee on Public Information, World War I propaganda, and later the FDR administration and corporate clients. In the 1930s, Bernays worked to legitimize the New Deal policies and immigrant-based pluralism. He wrote, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." Yes. Bernays deliberately used Freudian psychology to bypass rational arguments and shape mass attitudes. He promoted cultural pluralism as a brand for corporations, e.g., Lucky Strike, Procter & Gamble, and the Roosevelt Coalition. And cultural pluralism was 1940s ESG and DEI for those that want a modern analog. Like, I was brilliant. He figured out how to get you to sell things to yourself. That was the game for him. He wasn't, you think back to like the Mad Max with the Lucky Strike stuff, toasted. Well, they're all toasted. Doesn't matter. You want them to sell it to themselves. So he was a master manipulator of that. The America First Committee in 1940 and 1941, and that was guys like Charles Lindbergh. They opposed the intervention in World War II and creeping internationalism of the New Deal. And Charles warned the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing war. They are a small minority, but they control much of our propaganda. And that was from his Des Moines speech, September 11th, 1941. Of course, Lindbergh was denounced as an anti-Semite, but his speech reflected a widespread suspicion among heritage Americans that Jewish elites were manipulating public opinion. They call this manufactured consent. And that is how America got into the World War II. I will not go into that in any more detail, but it was manufactured consent. All right. Oscar Hanlon, reframing the American history as a nation of immigrant. Is this the right graphic? What? Bear with me 1 second. I'm on part 2. Oh, no, this was Edwin Bernays. This was Congressman Albert Johnson, who's a patriot. And here's Oscar Hanlon. All right, we're back on track, people. Oscar Hanlon, Boston's immigrants, wrote Boston's Immigrants in 1941. The Uprooted in 1951. Hanlon, a Jewish professor at Harvard, argued all Americans except Native Americans are immigrants or descendants of immigrants, and that the immigrant experience is the Central American experience. His famous opening sentence, "I once thought to write a history of the immigrants in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history." Hanlon was a protege of Jewish historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, and he wrote key reports for the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, that shaped immigration reform. His work directly repudiated the older Anglo-Saxonist historiographies of Bancroft and Turner. This guy was out with a specific mission to revise American uh, uh, academics in favor of openness and retelling the whole story as being an immigrant tale. This is the guy where you have the Reddit idiots that say like, "Oh, you're an immigrant too. You came over on a boat. You're not a Native American." It's like that's propaganda from this guy. Hanlon's thesis was immediately challenged by historian John Hingham, Patriot, who in Strangers in the Land, 1955, documented the persistence of nativism and ethnic conflict, implicitly rejecting the melting pot orthodoxy. However, Hanlon's view won over in academia, and the result was the removal of textbooks that emphasized Anglo-Saxon heritage and the importation of this nation of immigrants line. Here's a looker. This guy. Will Herberg, Protestant Catholic Jew, was the name of his book in 1955. Herberg was a Jewish convert to Christianity, Catholicism. He was an RC, but still retained a proud Jewish ethnicity. And he wrote that America had become a, quote, triple melting pot. And there's not just one melting pot, there's three of them. Where the three great faiths were equal pillars of American identity. He argued that ethnicity was giving way to religious identity. The American way of life is the operative faith of the American people. Three religions are the legitimate ways of being an American. His thesis was to de-emphasize the racial differences and promote creedal national identity. So his idea was like, oh well, we know they were Anglo-Prots, right? And we could be like Pan-Protestant, I guess. We're going to throw the Catholics in there, because we have so many Irish immigrants and that sort of thing. And the Italians, of course, we have to account for the Italians. And the Jews, we have three religions. If only he knew there was a fourth Abrahamic faith that would become popular for immigrants in the U.S. He might have called it the four pillars of the four pillar melting pot or something. Also worth noting, this guy was a communist radical his entire life, and then right around the time Bill Buckley set up the National Review, he magically became a Catholic conservative. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but in the 1950s he transitioned to a Catholic and began writing for the National Review, for the Straussians over there, as one does. Herberg's book was praised by liberal Protestants, all those damn mainliners, and Jews, but criticized by the Christian right. Carl McIntyre's Christian Beacon in 1956 wrote that ignoring the fact that America was specifically founded as a Christian nation. So we've gone through a little chunk of history. In the background of much of this is World War II. And we all know Mean Mustache Man. We all know, what was happening at the time. What was happening at the time in America was the propaganda, was that nationalism was the reason we were in World War II. We had to win the war for democracy and for the Western way of life, as these nationalists were despotic, they were dictatorial, they were violent, and inherently they were pathological. And so part of the academic move towards openness was the pathologizing of any sort of closedness. Closed-mindedness became a something akin to schizophrenia. If you were a nationalist, you might as well check yourself in to a padded cell because you're insane. And we have the academics to prove it. So in 1950, Adorno, Frankel, Brunswick, Levinson, and Sanford, two of which were within that Frankfurt School at Columbia, they wrote The Authoritarian Personality. This study was funded by the American Jewish Committee's Department of Scientific Research, sponsored by the Studies in Prejudice series, which was a book, which this book was a part. And you can find that in the AJCDC Annual Report 1949, available in the American Jewish Archives. The central thesis of the book was authoritarianism as a personality syndrome rooted in harsh, punitive childhood experiences. So you were just traumatized as a child. That's why you want to have a country for your own people. The F scale, F is for fascist, was designed to measure pre-fascist tendencies, which the authors claimed were more common in right-wing, ethnocentric, and anti-Semitic individuals. The book explicitly linked nationalism, conventionalism, and hostility towards outgroups to a pathological personality structure. The impact was the F scale became widely used in psychology and political science to label conservative or nativist attitudes as authoritarian and anti-democratic. It was cited in curriculum reform in the 1965 voting rights litigation and in later multiculturalist policies. The Heritage American reaction, conservative historian Christopher Leish attacked the book in the New York Book Review of Books in 1966, calling an attempt to equate mental health with left-wing politics. Psychologist Raymond Cattell later criticized the F scale for its confounding of personality with political ideology. Nevertheless, the book remained canonical text in social psychology through the 1990s. The Radical Right by Daniel Bell. Primary source Daniel Bell, The Radical Right, expanded from the 1955 New American Library Symposium, originally titled The New American Right. The Fund for the Republic, which was a Ford Foundation offshoot, provided grants for the study of right-wing extremism. The central thesis of the radical right, McCarthyism, the John Birch Society, etc., was a psychological reaction to status anxiety, displacement, and fear of modernization. Contributors including Richard Hofstadter, Seymour Martin Lipsat, and Peter Viereck argued that right-wing movements were paranoid and pathological. Hofstadter's own essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, 1964, became a classic label for any populist or nativist movement. So, you either have childhood trauma, or you're just a goofy guy that is really, really scared of things that are changing. If you don't like the things that we're doing to you, you might be a radical. The book helped create a consensus in academia that right-wing nationalism was a symptom of maladaption rather than a legitimate political position. The framing was later used to dismiss Heritage American opposition to immigration. The Heritage American reaction, obviously, the John Birch Society Patriots published a rebuttal pamphlet, The Radical Left, The Myth of the Radical Right, in 1956. The National Review, William F. Buckley, not too patriot, criticized the book's psychologizing but remained respectful, as Buckley always did. Another one, Open and Closed Mind, in 1960 by Milton Rokeach. Primary source, Open and Closed Mind Investigations into the Nature of Belief Systems and Personality Systems. The National Institute of Mental Health and the Rockefeller Foundation were the primary funders of this book. And the central thesis is Rokeach developed the dogmatism scale, the D scale, to measure closed-mindedness. And he argued that dogmatism and authoritarianism were interchangeable personality traits that correlate with prejudice, ethnocentrism, and right-wing ideology. The book expanded Adorno's F scale into a general theory of cognitive rigidity. So if you weren't childhood traumatized or you're not scared, then you're just stupid in your brain. You have no mental elasticity. The D scale became standard tool in social psychology used in studies that linked conservatism to low openness and low experiences. It influenced later personality research, example John Jost's system justification theory. The Heritage American reaction to this, conservative psychologist Robert Altmaier criticized the D scale for conflating ideological content with cognitive style, but his own right-wing authoritarianism scale simply renamed the same construct. So psychology was cooked, fellas. And then the last one, In the Name of Prejudice by Gordon Allport. This was funded by the Carnegie Corporation and the Anti-Defamation League. The central thesis was prejudice, especially ethnic racial prejudice, is a cognitive error, a form of faulty and inflexible generalization. Allport argued that prejudice could be reduced through in-group contact, the contact hypothesis. He described ethnocentrism as a personality malady that could be cured through education. The contact hypothesis became the basis for school desegregation. busing, multicultural curricula, and later DEI training. The book was widely cited in Brown versus Board of Education by social scientists. The book was denounced by segregationist psychologists as pro-integration propaganda. The White Citizens Council distributed pamphlets claiming Allport's work was funded by Jews and the group and groups to and by groups trying to break down racial segregation. And yeah, what we found out was that proximity doesn't breed love or understanding. It breeds contempt if you're able to survive it. A couple more here. Moving on to the 50s and 60s, the liberal immigration consensus in defeat of national origins. So the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, which retained the national origin system, was passed over Truman's veto. No, so Congress passed it. Truman vetoed it. Congress passed it again with a supermajority, got it through, and the McCarran-Walter Act explicitly invoked the creedal view. The idea behind the system is in Truman's veto message, he explicitly invoked the creedal view. The idea behind this system is un-American. It is the philosophy of the Nazi state. We do not want a race-conscious immigration policy. Truman recruited Jewish intellectuals, including David Reisman and Oscar Handlin, to draft this language. So this is a pamphlet against the McCarran-Walter Act, and you could see even then, everything they don't like is going to be harkening back to the evil mustache man. The defeat of the national origins in 1965 was a crushing political loss for heritage Americans. This is referring to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which repealed this the McCarran-Walter Act. Senator Sam Ervin, Democrat of North Carolina, warned, "This bill will destroy the ethnic composition of our nation as it was formed by our ancestors." And that's part of the congressional record from the 1965 Immigration Act debate. Sam Francis, later a paleoconservative columnist, wrote, "The legislative suicide of the historic American nation." Next one. JFK is a Nation of Immigrants pamphlet and book. It was originally a pamphlet published by the New York Times in 1963, and then a book published in 1964 posthumously. Kennedy wrote, "Every American who ever lived, with the exception of one group, was either an immigrant himself or a descendant of immigrants." So here we have a recalling of everyone that was a settler or a colonist was also an immigrant, inflating those two terms. The book originated as a pamphlet Kennedy authored as a junior senator in 1958, distributed by the Anti-Defamation League, of course. Sam Ervin, Democrat of North Carolina, called Kennedy's proposals a formula for racial suicide during the 1965 immigration debate. The pamphlet was denounced by the American Legion and the Sons of the American Revolution, based Patriots. Got to take a little sip of the silly. All right. Almost there. Emanuel Hart-Celler and Philip Hart, architects of the Hart-Celler Act. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was introduced by Congressman Emanuel Celler, a Jewish legislator who had been fighting since the 1920s to repeal national origin quotas. Co-sponsored by Senator Philip Hart, a Democrat from Michigan, and an Irish Catholic. Celler stated on the House floor, "This bill will wipe out the bigotry and discrimination in our immigration law. It'll make America a truly universal nation." This is in contrast with Ted Kennedy, who at the same time was trying to sell the act to his own constituency, saying it will not alter the demographics of America. The bill primarily passed through a coalition of Jewish organizations like the ADL and the American Jewish Committee, Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, and labor unions. The bill was opposed by the American Legion, the Daughters of the Revolution, the Immigration Restriction League. Senator James Eastland, Democrat of Missouri, said, "This is the most dangerous bill to ever come before Congress, and it will destroy the ethnic and cultural balance of the nation." Guess what? He was right. It did. Now, we've gone through an entire most of the 20th century here. We're in the 70s. We've gone through how there was an academic foundation, or so we've gone through how they came, they were able to generate wealth through both legitimate and illegitimate means. They were able to leverage that wealth in local and federal politics, specifically within the FDR administration. They were able to leverage the work of that administration to get them going in other avenues. Meanwhile, the Columbia University was set up as a haven for Jewish intellectuals in Europe, as well as Harvard began to accept immigrants as well. So they entered into academia and began working on an academic, I guess, an academic justification for revising the American mode of existence from being ethnic based to being creedal, to being a nation of immigrants, to being a melting pot, to harkening back to the turn of the century, and conflating settlers with immigrants. And so we get to the Hart-Celler Act, and this is the kind of the culmination of their work. America was finally ready. The Civil Rights Act was happening. People were ready to go. The hippie movement was in full swing. They were ready to abandon the chains of tradition. They were ready to abandon any loyalty they felt to their ancestors. Besides, America, we had slavery, so we're inherently evil. And so with the 1965, with the Hart-Celler Act, we're putting a cap on white America and letting the rest of the world come in pretty much as they want. But how do we solidify this? How do we sell it to the normies? So we have activists, we have leftists, we have progressives, we have Jewish people, Jewish political activists, Jewish academics, Jewish marketing and psychologists. But how do we sell this to like the normie guy? How do we sell this to the guy whose job is going to be taken at the steel mill by an influx of migrant labor to Pittsburgh from parts unknown? How do we sell him? Well, that's our next guy, Norman Lear. This is an example for you. Norman Lear was one of the best to do it in terms of using television as an indoctrination mode. So he was the producer of All in the Family, 1971 and 1979. He produced the spin-off show called Maude, The Jeffersons, 75 to 85. Lear was a Jewish television producer, and explicitly stated his goals was to use sitcoms to drain the bigotry from American culture. In a 1974 interview with Archives of American Television, he said, "I wanted to push the tolerance message. I wanted to show the Archer Bunkie types were ignorant and that the future belonged to the open-minded." Lear's shows routinely depicted traditional white Christian Americans, example Archie Bunker, as bigoted buffoons. And his foundations, the People for the American Way, founded in 1980, explicitly targeted the Christian right and the heritage American nationalism. And it worked. One of the reasons we all dislike the boomers so much is because they were the generation that was raised by the TV, right? So when Norman Lear shows were on, they were kids. They were gathered around the TV to watch their favorite shows. There was only like 3 channels, and so you would just watch TV, and this was appointment TV. And the shows were specifically tailored to be like all the black characters in these shows were very anglicized black characters. The Jeffersons, they had their funny little outbursts, like what was the guy? One of the characters, anytime he moved into a room, he'd clap his hands and go "dynamite," right? They had their eccentricities, but they were non-threatening, right? And so that's how Lear was able to use the propaganda. With Maude, she had an abortion, but it was like non-threatening. It was like hinted at. And Archie Bunker, Archie Bunker was the dad in All in the Family, and he was always going off about the hippies, this, and really just lampooned as a conservative. And what that was doing was giving people permission to hate their dads, who were expressing views that were out of vogue. They were out of fashion at this time. So the rise of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson from the Christian Coalition was a direct counter to Lear's secularization campaign. Falwell in 1983, in his sermon, He said the media elites, largely from New York and Hollywood, he meant Jews, are trying to secularize the nation and destroy our heritage. They laugh at our faith and at our flag. The Christian right won political victories but lost the culture war in television and film, and it's because it doesn't matter what you do if you let your kids watch the boob tube. Doesn't matter if you're still gonna send your kid to college. You're gonna send your daughter to college. You're gonna send, you're gonna let your kid sit in front of a tablet unsupervised. You're allowing the electric J in your room to propagandize your kids against your own people. Moving on, Michael Novak, the rise of unmeltable ethics. So Michael Novak, in his 1972 book, The Rise of Unmeltable Ethics, he was a Catholic journalist of Slovak descent, and he argued white ethnic groups, Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs, had been marginalized by WASP elites and were now being displaced by the new multiculturalism. He wrote, "The new ethnicity is a movement of self-defense. We are being asked to sacrifice ourselves on the altar of someone else's universalism." Novak's book was part of a white ethnic revival that briefly challenged the liberal consensus. So even the newcomers that just happened to be white, this Slavic guy, he was like, wait a second, this isn't working out for me anymore. The immigration program and our laws and all this multiculturalism, this doesn't benefit me. It was fine when we were just doing it to those Anglo Protestants. Of course, the ADL attacked Novak for fostering ethnic separatism, and the New York Times dismissed his book as nostalgic tribalism. It's so passé. It's so passé, cute little white man, to want to have any sort of ethnic continuity for your people. In 1978, the New Ethnicity and the Civil Rights Act Commission, Jimmy Carter's Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy in 79, recommended an increase of legal immigration and eliminating race-based preferences. The commission was chaired by Father Theodore Hesburgh, Catholic, but heavily staffed by Jewish academics such as Lawrence Fuchs, or Fuchs, I'm not sure which, but we'll go with Fuchs at Brandeis University. Fuchs authored the American Kaleidoscope in 1990, which argued America had always been a nation of immigrants. Of course, we need reinforcing propaganda. The Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR, was founded in 1979 by John Tanton, a white environmentalist concerned about population growth and cultural preservation. And Tanton's internal memos, later leaked, warned about the displacement of the founding stock. So even our environmentalists were like, wait a second, it was white. It was only really the white people that lived here for hundreds of years that cared about like not polluting and not throwing trash in the river. Another example is that's father. What's his name? Yeah, that's the Kaleidoscope. All right, Reagan's farewell address. This guy, in his farewell address to the nation, January 11th, 1989, he said, "Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we are a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas. If we ever close the door on new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost." Reagan explicitly endorsed the creedal view, stating that anybody who embraces the ideas of freedom and democracy is an American. Of course, paleoconservative writer Samuel Francis, writing in Chronicles in 1989, called the speech the funeral oration of the historic American nation. Pat Buchanan also criticized it as a blank check for demographic transformation. And to be fair, this is 3 years after Reagan gave amnesty to the illegal Mexicans, primarily which were located in California and out west for the agricultural industry. Gave millions of them amnesty, and you'll never see another election like the one that voted, California going all for Ronald Reagan. That age is gone. You imported too many Mexicans, and now California is to be leftist. In the 1990s, oh yeah, here's his amnesty thing. In the 1990s, the Immigration Act, signed by George H.W. Bush, created the Diversity Immigration Visa Lottery, which allocated 55,000 visas per year to the countries with low historic immigration rates. The purpose, according to Senator Ted Kennedy, who this guy killed a girl, okay, was to ensure that no region of the world is left out of the American dream. So the result was a surge in African, Asian, and Middle Eastern immigration. So it's not just that our principles have to have universal appeal. We're not just a nation of a creed that's vague, universal principles that you have to come here and participate and believe in freedom. Now we have to. It's mandatory. We have to go out to all of the world. We cannot leave a single corner of the world exposed. It was any day. In the '90s, they were about ready to go to North Sentinel Island and find those tuki guys with their sticks and just kidnap a few of them and bring them to America, make them Supreme Court justices. Here's a patriot, Samuel Huntington in 1995. So here's kind of a patron saint of opposition to this whole movement. In his paper, the Hispanic Challenge in Foreign Policy magazine, 1996, Huntington, a Harvard political science who was a WASP, a good old WASP, he argued that the persistent immigration from Latin America posed a demographic and cultural threat to the historic American identity. And he wrote, "There is no Americano dream. There's only the American dream, created by Anglo-Protestant society. Mexican Americans will create a separate culture that rejects Anglo-Protestant identity, like every single other immigrant class that has come since the turn of the 20th century has done." I added that last bit. It's not Huntington. Huntington expanded this into a book called Who Are We? This was part of the Paleocons. This was the early part of the Ressourcement Project. This is when it first got started. He was a pioneer. Huntington obviously was denounced by the ADL and the Mexican American League and the Education Fund. That's one word. Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. But Paleocons and nationalists were all about it. So by 1990, it's orthodoxy now. I've shown you countless examples. They keep referring to the nation of immigrants. Everyone's an immigrant except for the OG natives that were displaced on the Trail of Tears. But it's ubiquitous in all of our culture, all of our politics, all of our law. We are not an Anglo-Saxon nation anymore. We never were. We were never Anglo-Protestant. We were always a nation of immigrants. Our founding was entirely ideological. And if you accept that ideology of freedom, vaguely, liberty, whatever, you can join. But if you don't accept it, you can still join. It doesn't really matter. As long as you're just not white was, I guess, the goal. So in Bill Clinton's 1995 State of the Union address, America is not a place. It is an idea. The only nation in the world built on a creed that all men are created equal. This statement, repeated by every subsequent president, is the ultimate triumph of the post-World War II revisionist view. Oh boy, little sip of the silly. The 1990 Immigration Act increased legal immigration to over 1 million per year. By the 2000 census, the historical European descendant population was below 70% for the first time. Pat Buchanan's 1992 Republican Convention speech, Cultural War, and his 1995 book, The Great Betrayal, argued that the proposition nation was a fiction used to dispossess the founding stock. Buchanan wrote, "The American idea is not a proposition. It is a people. It is the people of Europe who built this country. To open the borders is to commit national suicide." Buchanan was denounced as a nativist, but his support among white working class voters, 40% in 1996, showed the persistence of heritage American identity. So that brings us to today. What are we doing, man? The nation of immigrants ideology is firmly implanted into the zeitgeist and is a foundational pillar of our political orthodoxy. The GOP fully embraces DEI diversity ideals, the same as the left. The difference, I guess, is merely consent. The GOP holds out hope that people can be convinced of some universalizing principles. The left just demands obedience to race communism and ultimately unlimited immigration from everywhere. In both cases, the American tradition is simply a window dressing. It's just star-spangled bullshit, guys. The founders were clearly racist. the They were functionally white supremacist. Yet, in order to exist in the political in a political character, sorry. Yet, in order to exist as a political character in today's power structure, you have to abstract the actions of the American founding into vague ideals of liberty and freedom and the American dream. Maria Salazar can put out press releases in Spanish, but still claim intellectual descendancy from the founding. The truth is, the underlying motivation for the Nation of Immigrants line is the same as it always was: displacement of heritage Americans from political and economic hegemony. The reasons have changed. Diversity is such that no one really fears reprisals from white nationalists anymore. The rise of a true fascist regime. They don't really fear the nativists anymore. The diasporic politics are in full swing. But, and the rise of any sort of fascism in the U.S. is kind of a pipe dream, a quaint hypothetical. The time has probably passed. But the GOP follows the Chamber of Commerce, and if they want to keep the labor input prices stagnant, suppress unionization efforts, and attract patronage from ascendant global wealth, well, who are we to judge? The left does all this, but with the veneer of virtue signaling about justice and kvetching about colonialism or some such nonsense. Who cares? Well, that's the timeline. My goal, again, I'm shotgunning this out there. I'm getting a bunch of points on a graph on a timeline to show you that there is a trend. The ideas are genealogically Jewish. So they came. Where did the progenitors of these ideas come from? Well, they came from the turn of the 20th century. Well, how'd they get funding, and how did they get academic gravitas? And these are the questions that I think are important to ask, because we're in a position now where it's like, what is this? Like Fort Bend County Republican Party, Ganesha. Anyway, into Vivek. Yeah, this is what the GOP celebrates, man. But we're not blackbilling. I believe in my people. I believe in my God. We're gonna do one more intermission here. I have something else for you guys. Whoops. One more intermission. And I'm going to go ahead and clear my throat a little bit.
On this anniversary, we must remember, we have to remember, we can never forget that American liberty has not endured for 250 years merely because of words on paper. Liberty has prevailed here because of the culture and character of the people who declared it, defended it, and preserved it. These are very, very special times, and this is a very special place. You live in a very special place. Congratulations, everybody. The identity of a nation is the destiny of a nation, and America has a destiny like no other because we are a people like no other. For whatever reason, that's just the way it is. Here, the old world sent its bravest, boldest, and most resilient, its fiercest, most faithful, and freedom-loving. These men and women brought values, traditions, and customs transmitted over the centuries in Britain and stretching back even further to Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. The United States of America is where the greatest civilization in human history became greater than ever before. On the grounds and granite hills and the rugged plains of this wide-open continent, they forged a uniquely American character, a new breed of citizen. That's you. Congratulations. Congratulations. You're not that new a breed. You're a really good breed, but I'm not sure that you're that new a breed. Americans did not bow before a king or a government, but kneeled only before Almighty God. That's right. These were the people who founded our republic. These were the patriots who fought for independence. This was the spirit that demanded freedom. And this was the culture that built America and carved its heroes into Mount Rushmore.
Probably one of the more base things Trump said. Obviously, he still has to, going back to my thesis, he has to couch it a little bit. Nevertheless, so I have given you timelines. I've given you my thesis. I've given you tools that I believe will graduate you out of noticing to being able to predict. It's like that meme, every single time, or when you learn enough, you won't have to like say every single time. I forgot how the meme goes. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Little sip of the silly. So, if you come across something that sounds like it's incongruous with our founding, this applies in theology too. If you come across a pastor that happens to be saying things that don't sound in line with traditional Christian orthodoxy, it's like, well, where did those ideas come from? Probably gonna have some involvement here with 20th century immigrants, turn of the 20th century immigrants that came and set up shop in academia, and law and politics, and media and culture, and brought new ideas, revised ideas to the American ethos. One example of this, and this is going to be brief, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but one example is a guy named Howard Zinn. By the 1960s, the revision of American history had already replaced the Anglo-Saxonist textbooks with Handlin-style Nation of Immigrant narratives. But Zinn went further. He rejected not only ethnic nationalism, but also liberal triumphalism. He argued that U.S. history was a story of oppressiveness and resistance, and that students should be taught from the perspective of the losers: Native Americans, black slaves, factory workers, women. His work became the radical edge of the Propositional Nation project. This guy was pushing it farther. It wasn't just about, well, you have to be inclusive. This is like, no, you have to be apologetic. You were the bad guys. You were the evil men in history, and you have to consider the perspectives of the people that you were mean to. And in fact, we're just going to lie. We're just going to bullshit our way through what those perspectives would be without really any sort of historical grounding. But that's enough. That's enough to get you to feel bad, white man, so that you don't notice what's happening around you. So in 1980, Howard Zinn's history is kind of crazy. He was a bomber in World War II, allegedly, like dropping napalm in Hungary, and was like real sad about that. Was a big part of the anti-Vietnam war activism. But by 1980, he wrote The People's History of the United States. And the book opens: to be neutral in a situation of injustice is to have chosen sides already, the side of the oppressor. So we are a purported history book, but we are going to go ahead and revise the history that we're teaching to be indiscernible from fact, but also not based in any fact. It is going to be just a hypothetical consideration of whatever the oppressed class might have believed. So Zinn explicitly rejected the idea of objective history. He was part of the increasingly popular postmodern Marxist cultural critique, and sought to reframe every major American event: Columbus, the Revolution, the Civil War, industrialization, Vietnam, as a clash between the plebs and the proles, the elites and the masses. The book sold 4 million copies by 2020, and it became the most popular alternative history textbook in high schools and colleges. So conservative historians like Arthur Schlesinger call it a polemic that distorts the past to serve a political agenda. Daniel Borston, liberal, librarian of Congress, said Zinn reduces history to a morality play. In 1985, the New York Times ran a review titled "The Marxist Interpretation of American History," but Zinn's defenders, including Noam Chomsky, who loved this guy, praised it as a necessary corrective. In 1990s, Zinn became becomes the dominant alternative textbook. And here's the play: where you're going to be the dominant alternative textbook, but we're going to frame it in a way that it is not necessarily understood by the consumer that it is alternative. Howard, the People's History of the United States, 1995, updated edition with new chapter on the 1990s, was adopted by high school teachers exponentially by 96, and this was the height of like the 90s, man, the sensitive 90s, man. You had the by 96, Zinn's text was used in over 1,000 college courses. Was being assigned in advanced placement U.S. history classes. AP U.S. history was basing part of their curriculum on an alternative history, a fiction book that was like, just, have we thought what the Indians might have felt like on the Trail of Tears? Zinn's narrative directly replaced the older great men of historiography. The teachers who assigned Zinn often no longer used standard textbooks like the American Pageant, which still emphasized Anglo-Protestant origins of the U.S. Zinn's book became canonical, History from Below. They bait and switched it. The National Association of Scholars in 97 published a report, The Decline of History in the Classroom, which cited Zinn as a key source of de-emphasis on Western civilization and American exceptionalism. Lynn Cheney, the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, singled out Zinn in a 1994 Wall Street Journal op-ed as the most dangerous historian in America. By 2008, the Zinn Education Project was launched. The zinnproject.org was co-founded by Zinn, Bill Bigelow, and Rethinking Schools, which is a progressive educators group. And the project mission statement was to teach a more accurate, complex, and engaging version of U.S. history, one that goes beyond the traditional narrative and challenges students to think critically about the past and their roles in that present. And what this means is that to teach a more accurate, bullshit, complex, leftist, and engaging, written for illiterate in Baltimore version of U.S. history that goes beyond the traditional, correct, narrative, fact, and challenges students to think critically, like a Marxist, about the past and their roles in the present as a leftist activist. The Zinn Education Project reached over 100,000 teachers by 2020, providing free lessons, lesson plans, primary source packets, and workshop training. It explicitly targeted bans on critical race theory and honest history in Republican-led states. The project became the institutional backbone for left-wing history curricula in public schools. The Republican Party and conservative media, Fox News, Daily Caller, Breitbart, launched repeated attacks. In 2021, several states, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Florida, passed laws banning the use of Zinn's book in public schools, calling it anti-American propaganda. Yes, burn it in a fire. The ZEP responded by suing the project, and the project's usage actually increased. Heritage parents organized school board takeovers to remove Zinn's materials, and I have a friend whose dad, it was partly this, partly trans bathroom stuff, but I have a friend whose dad went to jail at one of these school board meetings. Just for being a little passionate as a public speaker. And then by 2010, Zinn's death and posthumous influence. He was the historian who challenged the status quo, died at 87. Gone too late. God could have taken him at 35 and we would have been fine. The obituary describes him as a historian who wrote from the perspective of the powerless and inspired a generation of activists. Yes, he wrote fiction that inspired a bunch of social justice warriors. Zinn's death cemented his status as a martyr among the left, and his book sales surged. By 2015, the People's History was assigned in 70% of U.S. History survey courses, according to a study by the American Historical Association. In 2011, the Texas State Board of Education attempted to remove Zinn from the approved textbook list, but the effort failed. A 2013 survey by the American Enterprise Institute found that 12% of high school teachers use Zinn exclusively, but 42% said they assigned experts. And here's some, just the background is just the obituary. Oh man, this guy. So from one man's life, we can see how efforts to assimilate largely failed. He hated the dominant Anglo-Prot culture of America, and it drove him to seek to promote insane revisionist views as having academic legitimacy. From there, leftists within the existing institutions promoted his work to the point where it was replacing actual collegiate curriculum. Future educators were educated on the people's history, and they took this work to their careers as elementary and high school classrooms, where they could indoctrinate the next generation of Americans to hate their parents. The systemic attack against one facet of American mythos was reinforced culturally through TV, popular culture, and millennials dropped the boomer idea of American exceptionalism or even that America was different from any other place on the planet. In fact, if we were different, it's because we were genetically predisposed to violence or oppression or something. And this is the